Hello. Lots of you will recognise me. I'm Reverend Jim and I work at St Matthew's Church. That's a big church on top of the hill. It seems a long time since I last did an assembly for you. And in my assemblies every year, I tell you true stories from the Bible and how they can teach us something. Last year, I started telling you some stories from the Old Testament. That's a bit of the Bible before Jesus was born. And I started to tell you stories about a boy called David. David was a shepherd boy. And the most well-known story about David is when he defeated a giant named Goliath. And I also told you another story about David's really good friend. David's best friend was called Jonathan, and Jonathan was a prince. He was the son of King Saul. Well, today's story is partly about what happened before David ever met King Saul. This is a story of how David became the king. You see, King Saul, he hadn't been a very good king. It had started out okay, but then it all went wrong. So God decided he needed someone else to be king. And he told the prophet Samuel to take some olive oil to anoint the next king. He would do that by pouring oil on the head of the person to show that they were anointed to be the king. Well, God sent Samuel to a man called Jesse. Jesse had lots of sons and he lived in a small town called Bethlehem. Jesse brought his 7 sons in front of Samuel. Samuel looked at the eldest, Eliab. He was tall and handsome. Surely this was the one. No, said God. You're only looking at the outside of them. I'm looking at their hearts. I'm looking to see what they're like on the inside. The next son came forward, Abinadab. He was tall and strong and handsome too. No, said God. Then Shammah came forward. Then the other 4 sons. No, 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 said God. Is this all your sons? Asked Samuel to Jesse. Well, the youngest, David, he's out in the fields looking after the sheep. Send for him, said Samuel. But he's only a little boy, said Jesse. Send for him. Eventually, David arrived. Now, David was a pretty boy, but he was only a boy, a small boy, strong for his age, but only a boy. Yes, God told Samuel, that's the one, anoint him. And so Samuel poured the olive oil on David's head to show that he would be the next king. Well, that happened many, many years before David had his fight with Goliath. And as time went on, King Saul got very jealous of David. It seemed like everybody wanted to be his friend. The king's son, Jonathan, he became David's best friend. The king's daughter, Michal, she married David. The people, they all loved David. And Saul got more and more jealous. Eventually, it got too much, and Saul tried to kill David. But Jonathan's, Saul's son, he warned David, and David escaped. But that wasn't the end. King Saul was really not happy, and he chased after David for years. On one occasion, Saul heard David was staying in a place called En-Gedi. He quickly got 3,000 soldiers and went out to try to capture David and his men. After a while, Saul needed to go to the toilet, and he saw some caves by the side of the road, and he thought, well, there may be a bear in there, but that would be a good place to go. What Saul didn't know was that David and his men were hiding right at the back in the dark, of the very same cave. Well, as Saul came into the cave, one of David's men whispered to David, "Now's your chance. You can kill Saul and become king." But David wouldn't do it. Instead, he crept forward, took out his knife and cut a bit of material off of Saul's cloak. After Saul had finished his business, he left the cave and went back to his men a little way away. David came out of the cave and he shouted after him, and he held up the cloth he'd cut off Saul's cloak, and he explained that he could have killed him. And suddenly Saul realised that David wasn't a danger to him. If he'd wanted to kill him, he could have, but he let him go free. So King Saul went home and stopped chasing David. Well, a little while later, King Saul went to war again. And sadly, Saul and his 3 sons, including David's best friend Jonathan, were killed in a battle. And the country of Israel was left without a king, or without anyone to become king, or at least that's what they thought. David went back to his home, the town called Bethlehem. And then some men came, and they reminded David that he was anointed to be the next king. Well, it wasn't popular with everyone, and David had to fight a lot of battles. But because David was a good man, and he did what God told him, he went on to become the most famous and the most popular king of Israel that they ever had. So that is how David became king. And that's how God kept his promise that he'd made many years before when Samuel anointed David. Now, it's always important to think, what has the Bible story got to do with me? What can I learn from it? And I was thinking about this, and I think there might be 2 things that we could learn today. Firstly, remember when God chose David? God spoke to Samuel, and he said it was what a person was like inside that was important, not what they looked like on the outside. And you might be able to think of the kind of things that God might like to see inside a person. Secondly, remember what happened in the cave. David had a chance to sort out all his problems by killing Saul, but he didn't, because that would be wrong. And I wonder, sometimes we might think, if I just did that, or if I did that, it would be okay. Perhaps if I tell a little lie, all my problems will be sorted out. Or perhaps if I do this or I did that, everything would be fine, even if what I'm doing isn't really right. But David did what was right, and God was pleased with him. And actually, the same is true today. If we do what is right, God is pleased with us. I'm going to say a prayer. If you agree with what I say, can you say Amen at the end? That's because the word Amen means, yes, I agree. Dear God, thank you that you teach us that what is inside a person is the most important thing. Help us to do what is right, even if it seems that to do something else would make our lives a bit easier. Thank you that you kept the promise you made to David when he was just a little boy. And thank you that you keep your promises to us. Amen.